All right, good morning. My name is Jeremy. I'm one of the pastors here. We are moving through our series in the book of Acts. Before we dive into Acts chapter 10, they'll give you a chance to find Acts chapter 10. Acts is in the New Testament. Let me just talk briefly about an announcement you've probably heard in the last couple of weeks. We are going to be hosting our kids camp again this summer. And so kids camp is for kids in pre-primary all the way through grade 5. But specifically this morning, I just want to talk to our church about an opportunity that we have as a church to serve these kids at kids camp. And so I specifically just want to invite you to be a part of kids camp through volunteering. It's a 3-day camp, and so you would have an opportunity to volunteer either one of those days or all 3 of those days. And I know for some of us, you're like, hey, I work during the day, and it's really a big ask, because what we're saying is, yeah, I know. Would you be willing to maybe even take a day off of work or take a couple days off of work? And here's kind of the challenge. I just want you to think about this, because, you know, I grew up in the church, and I went to kids camp. Vacation Bible School is what we called it. And here's the thing about Vacation Bible School. Went my whole life. You know, I can't tell you today, I don't remember any of the subjects. I don't remember any of the lessons. I don't even remember really any of the crafts or the games. But what I do remember the people that served at our Vacation Bible School, at our kids' camp. And so what I've learned over the years is I've learned that as an adult, as someone who can serve in that capacity, is you can give up a day or 3 days of your life in order to have kind of an eternal impact in the life of some kid. And so I just want to challenge our church to say, hey, as kids camp is coming up and you're going to hear more of that being announced, I just want to say, hey, would you jump in and would you help us? There's not a whole lot of things in your life that you have an opportunity, you know, in giving your, 3 or 4 or 5 hours a day. There's not a lot of things that you can invest that time and get such a big impact. But kids camp is going to be one of those things. And so I would invite you to be a part of that with us. You can go on the website. There's a QR code there. It'll take you to the kids camp page. And on that kids camp page, you can actually see there's a link for you to sign up and volunteer as well. So I'm hoping we have an army of people that'll come out and they'll serve these kids, and we'll see God do an amazing thing in those few days. All right, Acts 10. I tried to drag that out as long as I could, okay? So now you should be in Acts chapter 10. As we're moving through this, one of the things that I enjoy reading about, watching shows about, I'm really into history. History is one of those things that I enjoy, and I love history because, when you look back at history, one of the things that you notice is that there's always, a few of people or events that, they have this ability to make a monumental shift in the course of history. Like there's a particular person that came along or a particular event that happened, and because of the existence of that event or that person, they kind of shaped or reshaped the trajectory of the future. So let me give you a few examples. So, for example, one of those in the 16th century was the Copernican Revolution. You have a guy named Nicholas Copernicus that comes along, and he just says, you know what, I might be crazy, but I don't think that our Earth is the center of the universe. I actually think that we orbit around the sun. And he caught a lot of flack for that, okay? Same as some of you who think that the earth is flat, all right? You catch a lot of flack for that for a reason, okay? But he comes along and he says, hey, guys, I want to throw this out there. And the Copernican Revolution kind of it changed the trajectory of science, and it just kind of changed the trajectory of the future in those fields. Or you think about in the 17th century, the 18th century, you think about the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution comes along, and that reshapes the complete workforce and the way that, at once we were an agrarian society, and now you have, fathers leaving the home and working outside of the home, and it's totally reshaped the way that we think about and do work in our society. Or even in the 19th century, you think about when Edison invented the light bulb. There was a time where you went to bed when it was dark and you got up when the sun came up, and the Edison inventing the light bulb kind of just reshaped the trajectory of the future. And so you have all these different events in history that because of this invention or this person, you have a massive shift. But it's not just in history. I mean, you can think about it in your own life, okay? In your own life, there's probably been, some event or some person that has come along and it's reshaped the trajectory of the future of your life. I think for me, okay, 1987 was the last year that I ate eggs, okay? So the one little quirk about me, if I come to your house and you serve me quiche, I'm not eating it, okay? You can hold that against me, but it is what it is. I'll eat anything else, but I won't eat eggs. For some reason, as a 3-year-old, I made a decision, okay, that I was no longer going to eat eggs, and it reshaped the trajectory of my life. But on a more serious note, back in 2002, I remember sitting in the first chapel service of the Christian university that I attended. And it wasn't a mandatory chapel service. You didn't have to go. But I remember sitting there worshiping alongside of hundreds of other university students. It was the first time in my life that I was surrounded by a bunch of people my age that wanted to follow Jesus. And I remember that day, it marked me. And I remember thinking on that day, I genuinely want to take my faith in Jesus seriously. And it changed the trajectory of my life. So I'm sure for you thinking about different events or people that have come along in your life that have done that. Well, when we get to Acts chapter 10, what you see that kind of shift taking place. It is a monumental shift, not only in the life of a guy named Peter, but in really the church itself. And so in Acts 10, we're reintroduced to the Apostle Peter, and it's in Acts 10 that the Apostle Peter learns that the gospel, the good news, the message of Jesus is not simply news that is for one particular people in one particular place. But what Acts 10 is going to show us, the big idea here is that the gospel is for all people. The gospel is for all people. It's weird for us to think about that now, but back that was a massive shift in the way that the early church was thinking. So we have to think for a second, okay? When we read the book of Acts, one of the things we have to ask ourselves at every different point is, why is this story here? Because here's the thing about the book of Acts. We can kind of be reading through it, and you can kind of think like, oh, this is great. It's just kind of a haphazard collection of stories from the early church, but that's not the case at all. The book of Acts, if you remember, was compiled strategically by a guy named Luke, and he's compiling all these stories for a particular purpose. There's a strategy behind that. And so when we get to Acts 10, this is not a random story here, but rather this is put here with a specific purpose. And that specific purpose is to remind us at every point throughout the history of the church that the gospel message is for all people. Which means, think about this, okay? If the gospel is for all people, what that means for you in your life is that the gospel is for everyone in your life. The gospel is for your family, it's for your friends, it's for your coworkers. That's the implication here. If the gospel is for all people, then it's for all people in your life. That also means that for some of us in here, that means that the gospel is for you. And what I mean by that is if you have not yet placed your faith in Jesus, then what you need to see today is that the gospel is specifically for you. And so what I want to do to kind of help unpack this, for us to understand this a little bit better, is I want to walk through Acts 10. We're not going to read every verse. We're going to read a little bit. I'll explain a little bit. We'll read a little bit more. And I want to point out 3 scenes that I think are very important for us in understanding this idea that the gospel is for all people. And so we're going to read through, make some observations, and then we'll apply the text. Sound good? All right, let's go. Acts chapter 10, verse 1. It says at Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort, a devout man, it says, who feared God with all of his household, who gave alms generously to the people, and he prayed continually to God. At about the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, Cornelius. And he stared at him in terror, and he said, what is it, Lord? And he said to him, your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea. And when the angel who spoke to him had departed, he called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier from among those who attended him, and having related everything to them, he sent them on to Joppa. So, first thing we have to ask is, who is this guy Cornelius? Well, Cornelius was a captain in the Roman army. If you were a captain in the Roman army, it meant that you were responsible for about 100 men. And what the implications of that were that you were probably very wealthy, that you probably had a lot of influence. And here specifically we see with Cornelius, it said that he was a God-fearer. So he has status and he has power, and it says that he's a God-fearer. Now, this is important for us to see, because here's where one of our first applications comes. The fact that it says that Cornelius is a God-fearer does not mean that Cornelius was a follower of Jesus. What this is helping us to see is that Cornelius was a guy who followed all of the rules, but that didn't necessarily mean that he had placed his faith in Jesus. I think this is helpful for us just to stop for a second and to pause and just to remember this. it is possible to follow the rules, but to not be a follower of Jesus. So it's possible to be a follower of all these different rules, but not necessarily be a follower of Jesus. This is what the Bible calls religion. And so religious people believe in God, but they think that in order to get right with Him, you have to be good. It's based on your effort. My effort earns me merit with God. If I try hard and I do a lot of good things, then surely God will be pleased with me. So what this ends up producing in our life is it produces people who look really good on the outside, but they are spiritually dead on the inside. I've used this example before. A couple winters ago, we were driving the kids to school, and we were going down Joseph Howe. And if you're going down Joseph Howe, right before you get to the Armadale Circle, you have Mount Olivet Cemetery there on your left. And it's a very old historic cemetery, and it has a lot of these old headstones that are very ornate. And I remember looking over, seeing the snow blanketing the cemetery, and I remember saying to my wife, like, wow, that cemetery looks beautiful. And in some ways, like it does. Like it just kind of had this landscape with the white snow, covering the tops of the tombstones. But it's one of those things that you say, and then you all of a sudden think about what you just said. You said, what I was saying was, the outside of this cemetery looks good. It doesn't matter how good the outside looks. The reality is, any cemetery is still full of dead bodies. That's what you get when you have religion. You have an outer shell that looks good because you're trying really hard to be good, but inside you are still dead. And the gospel here is reminding us that it's not about you being a good person in order to get to God. The gospel says that even though you are not good, the Bible uses the word sin, even though you are sinful, God came to you. That's the difference between the religion and the gospel. The gospel is not you doing good works to get to God. It's that even in your sin, God came to you. And if we believe in Him, if we believe in Jesus, the good news is we get His, what the Bible says, righteousness, His right living. And so the gospel in short is that Jesus, He actually lived the life that you and I were supposed to live. We were supposed to live perfectly, but we can't do that. And so what did Jesus do? Well, He lived that life in our place. And yet, even though we are deserving of death, that's the punishment for our sin, Jesus took that punishment on our behalf. The reason that the gospel is good news is because Jesus didn't stay dead. He rose from the dead. And it's because of that, when we place our faith in Jesus, that we have a restored and a right relationship with God. And so the first thing we see here is a reminder, it's possible to follow the rules, but to not be a follower of Jesus. But the other thing I think is really helpful to see here, and that Cornelius in his life is teaching us, is that God is often at work in people and in places when we're not even aware. You think about Cornelius' life here. He just kind of like pops up in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't on the disciples' radar. He wasn't in their evangelism plan. Then what you realize with Cornelius' life is that this is how God works. He's often at work in people and in places that we're not even aware of. So you're like, well, what exactly is happening here in Acts chapter 10? Well, what's happening here is that God is doing what He said. God is building His church. In fact, Jesus Himself made this promise to the disciples, specifically to the Apostle Peter, when Jesus was still alive and before He had ascended back up into heaven. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, Jesus says this. He says, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And then here's what Jesus says, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. What Jesus is saying is, I'm going to build my church, and there is nothing that can stand in the way. And so when you see this happening in Acts 10, you begin to realize, like, this is Jesus' promise coming to fulfillment. And one of the things that astonishes me, when you read a story like this in the book of Acts, you can kind of think, well, that's great, that happened then. But if you begin to kind of look at some of what is happening in kind of our modern world, particularly in places around the world that are closed off to the gospel, meaning countries where it's illegal to teach about Jesus, one of the things you're realizing is these kind of Cornelius-type stories, they're happening all the time. There's an article I read in Missions Frontiers magazine a while back, and they had surveyed about 600 or so Muslims that had come to faith in Jesus. And one of the things that they found was that about a quarter of those Muslims who came to faith in Jesus, so a couple hundred Muslims that they had talked to that came to faith in Jesus, they had done so because of some dream that they had that they were convinced was from God. And so here's one story. I thought this was so intriguing. One of the stories goes like this. A Persian migrant who arrived at a refugee center at 6 a.m., he was visibly upset. He told his story to a Persian pastor. He says during the night, he saw someone dressed in white raise his hand and say, "Stand up and follow me." The Persian man said, "Who are you?" And the man in the white replied, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, and I am the way to heaven. No one can go to the Father except through me." He began to ask the Persian pastor, "Who is he? What am I going to do? Why did he ask me to follow him? How shall I go? Tell me." In response, the pastor held out his Bible and he asked, "Have you seen this before?" "No," the man replied. "What is it?" The pastor then opened to the book of Revelation and he read, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." The man started crying and he said, "How can I accept him? How can I follow him?" And so the pastor led him in prayer and peace came over him. And the pastor then gave the man a Bible and told him to hide it since the Muslims in the camps could use it to cause trouble. But the man replied, "The Jesus that I met today, he's more powerful than the Muslims in the camp." And he left, and an hour later he brought back 10 other Persians and he told the pastor, "These people want a Bible too." No one had to teach him an evangelistic strategy. You see, God is working in people and in places that we don't even know. We're not even aware of. And at every turn in the book of Acts, we are reminded that God builds in His strength according to His timing and in the way that God chooses to build. I don't know about you, but there's a lot of times in my life that I need that reminder. I need that reminder not only as a pastor, but as a father, as a disciple, that God is at work even though I can't see. I know that there's some of you in here today that you need that reminder clearly in your life. If you're being honest with yourself, maybe you're at a point in your life where you're just not sure that God is at work anymore. Maybe you're doubting that God is at work in you personally. Maybe you're doubting that He's at work in your family, in your child. And what you need to be reminded of is that even though you can't see it, the Bible is helping to remind us here is that God is always at work. One of my favorite things about the landscape here in Nova Scotia, I think it's super cool. I love those massive windmills. I just think it's so cool. And so you're driving around and you just see these huge windmills on the side of a hill and you see the turbines spinning. One of the things that's so striking though is there's, many times where, I'll get out of the car or I'll be outside that day and I'll notice like it's not really windy outside. I can't feel the wind, I can't see it, but I look up and I can see the turbines are still spinning. And so what that reminds me is that even though I can't feel the wind, even though I can't see it, when I look up and see the turbines spinning, I'm like, well, the wind's still blowing. And I think for some of us in here, let that be Cornelius' story in your life. Let that be the windmill. You might not feel or sense God moving or blowing in your life, but when you look here in Acts chapter 10, let that be the thing that reminds you that even though you don't feel the gospel winds blowing, God is still at work in your life. Let that be a comfort to us. Now, there are others of us in here, though, that maybe you're not a follower of Jesus. But I would guess in a room this size that there are those of us in here that God is at work in your life, very similar to how He was at work in the life of Cornelius. Some of you are like, well, I don't know. I haven't had an angel show up at my bed, okay? Fair. That's fair, all right? But what I mean by that is you have most definitely felt, maybe in this last season, maybe at some point in your life, you have felt that urge. You have felt something pricking and prodding your heart. You have felt an unsettling. Maybe someone has even spoken into your life and said, you know what, I feel like God's after you. You have these nudges in your life. This is God pursuing you. I love what C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite authors, I talked about his story last week. Well, one of his most famous works, Mere Christianity, he talks about this. Here's what C.S. Lewis says. He says, most people, if they had really learned to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want and want acutely something that cannot be had in this world. there are all sorts of things in this world that offer to give it to you, but they never quite keep their promise. And then here's what he says. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Listen to me, I know that for some of us in here today, if you were honest, you've sensed this. That statement from Lewis is something that resonates deeply in your soul. You've been wrestling with this truth, and God might not be sending you an angel, but he is pricking and prodding your heart. And my challenge for you today is don't resist. God is pursuing you. Don't resist him. And so this is Cornelius, but he's not the only one that gets a vision. Peter gets a vision as well. So let's pick back up in verse 9. In verse 9 it says, the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. And he became hungry and wanted something to eat, but while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance. Some of you can identify with that. You're like, that's what it looks like when I get hangry. Like I'm in a trance, you know? That's not what's happening to Peter here, okay? He's not hangry. And he saw the heavens open and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. In all of it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice that said, rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, by no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. And the voice came to him again and a second time, what God has made clean, do not call common. This happened 3 more times, which means Peter was arguing with God about this. And the thing was then taken up into heaven. We're going to get to the explanation of exactly what's happening here. But you can kind of tell, and what actually happens in the next few verses, from 17 to 23, is that Peter's there pondering, what the heck was this vision that I just had? This is the most confusing thing ever. And it's at that time that the Spirit of God tells him, hey, there's some guys outside, and apparently you're supposed to go tell the gospel to a guy named Cornelius in Joppa. And Peter's like, I think that vision might have had something to do with that. But before we get there, one of the things that I want to make sure we see is that as Peter receives this vision, he doesn't want to accept it. And you're like, why? It was a very offensive thing for Peter. And what God was asking him to do in response to this was very offensive. And so one of the things I think, just by way of application, that we need to be reminded about here as we see this vision that Peter gets is that God calls us to do uncomfortable things. There are things in our life that God is going to call us to do that are uncomfortable to us. So what's happening here with Peter? So you say, okay, what does that mean? I don't understand. Well, let me give you some context. Remember that Cornelius is a captain in the Roman army, and he's living in Caesarea. Well, Caesarea, that city, that was the capital of the Roman occupation of Israel. And so the Jewish people, they couldn't stand Caesarea because it represented all of the ungodliness. Like they thought those people are so far away from God, and so they couldn't stand the city of Caesarea. Not only that, they couldn't stand the Romans, and especially Roman soldiers, because the Roman soldiers, they represented the oppression of the Roman army against the Israelites. And so here's God giving Peter a vision and telling Peter to go to the very person and to the very place that he despises the most. So let's just do a little thought experiment, okay? Just to kind of get ourselves in the context of Peter here. Okay, I just want us to do a little thought experiment. I just want you to think, okay, in your own life, okay, where is that place for you that if you had to go there, you would just kick and scream? Like, where is that one place in your life that I can't stand to go to that place? Maybe it's because of the traffic. Maybe it's because you had a bad food experience. Okay, so I just want us to all get that kind of visual in our mind. Don't say it out loud, okay? You might hurt someone's feelings, okay? I'm pretty sure that we're all thinking of the same place, though. It's New Jersey, okay? And so if you're like me, it's New Jersey, and it always has been New Jersey. As a Philly kid growing up, that's what it was, okay? You think about that, right? That just visual in your mind, you're like, oh, I don't like to go there. Like that is to a, multiplied degree, that is what God is calling Peter to do here. I think one of the reasons that so many of us can identify with Peter is because we see Peter here arguing with God. And we're like, that's kind of more the type of Christian that I am. Peter here he's like, God, look, I hear you. In fact, actually, I see you. I see this vision, but I'm not actually sure I'm hearing you right. Like, I think we might have like a bad connection. You know? Like, I'm not sure, God, if that's exactly what you're calling me to do. Peter here he's arguing with God, and in his arguments, what you realize is he doesn't want to do what God is telling him to do. So I think it begs the question for us, how many times in our life do we feel like God has called us to do something or to go somewhere, has instructed us in his word to do something that we're like, yeah, God, I hear you, but... Like, God, I hear you're calling me to forgive this person in my life, like, but, God, you're calling me to be generous with my things that you've given me in my life, but, like, I don't know, God. God, you're calling me to share the gospel with this person in my life, but, like, and one of the things we have to realize when we do that is what we're saying in those moments is, God, I know that you are God, but I'm just not sure that I can trust you with this one. I think you might have made a mistake on this one. And so I just got to ask the pointed question, like, what is God calling you to do right now in your life that you might be resisting simply because it makes you uncomfortable? What I need us to see here, and I think what the Bible is trying to teach us, is that discomfort is never a good reason for disobedience. Never. And so here, Peter is called to do something that is taking him far outside of his comfort zone. So, I didn't mention this, but the first scene was these weird visions. All right, that's the first scene, weird visions. Well, it brings us to the second scene, and the second scene is in verse 23. Start with me in verse 23. The next day he rose, and he went away with them. And some of the brothers at Joppa accompanied him. This is Peter. Peter's on his way now to Cornelius. And on the following day, they entered Caesarea. So you just think about what we just said. Peter's going into a place that he despises the most. Okay, now he's entering. You just feel that visceral feeling. You're driving into New Jersey. You got it. And on the following day, they entered Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them, and he called together his relatives and close friends. He's like, guys, you got to come here. This is crazy. I want you to hear whatever this guy's about to tell me. And when Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshiped him. Think about that for a second. Peter, the apostle, is a Jew who despises the Roman Gentile. The first thing that he does is he falls down. He bows before this Roman centurion, or the centurion bowed before Peter. He commands an army of hundreds of people, and yet he bows to this fisherman here. But Peter lifted him up, saying, "Stand up, I too am a man." And as he talked with him, he went in, and he found many persons gathered. And he said to them, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation." He's like, just so we're clear, this is making me feel very uncomfortable. But God has shown to me that I should not call, this is it, that I should not call any person common or unclean. There's the vision with the application. This is what God is showing me, that I should not call any person common or unclean. So we understand that in Peter's context, it would have been very difficult for him to do this. You can understand why it would have made Peter hesitant. If you go to the book of Leviticus, that's usually the book of the Bible that people get tripped up in. They have their Bible reading plan, and they're doing really strong, and then they hit the book of Leviticus, and they're like, maybe next year, you know. But in the book of Leviticus, because it's a book all about rules, the book of Leviticus in chapter 11, there's an entire chapter devoted to teaching the Israelites all the things that they're not allowed to eat. So Peter has this entire list of things that he's not supposed to eat, and now God is giving him this vision that he's allowed to go eat these things. It's kind of like when you were in school. I don't know if you had that one teacher. They were the best teacher. They always let you have a cheat sheet, you know. And you have a cheat sheet, and so you're always writing on a little 3x5 card as tiny as you can. You're trying to fit all the notes on there. And the time comes for the test, and the teacher's like, hey, you can take out your cheat sheet. I was the kid who was like, I know, just the name, cheat sheet, you know? Like I was such a rule follower that I was like, I hear what you're saying. I feel like this is a trick, you know? Like I didn't want to bring out my cheat sheet because I thought I was going to get busted for it. Now, there were some kids in my class that they took out that cheat sheet. They were very eager. I'm like, look, I don't know. Seems like you're very comfortable with the cheat sheet, you know? But it was one of those moments where you're like, I hear what you're saying, but like, is this a trick? God is not trying to trick Peter. In fact, what God is doing and giving Peter this vision and sending him to Cornelius is he's reminding the disciples of his intended plan in the first place. What God had said all the way back, when Jesus, before he ascends into heaven, he says in Acts 1:8, he says to the disciples, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem." Okay, get that, to the Jews. But then Jesus says, no, and to Judea, and to Samaria, and to the very ends of the earth. So I want to mention two important things here as it relates to the explanation about these visions. The first is what God is telling Peter to do. This is not a new mission. It's not like God is all of a sudden calling an audible and saying like, hey, now we're actually going to, I didn't think about this before, but now we're going to start telling the gospel to all these other people. No. God's plan from the beginning was that the gospel was for all people. You go all the way back to the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 12, there's a man named Abraham, and God is making a promise to Abraham, and this is what he says to the promise of Abraham. He says, in you, all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. Psalm 22. It says, all the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and the families of the nations shall worship before you. So this is not a new mission. This is God reiterating his mission from the beginning, that God desires for all people to be saved. But the other thing that I think is helpful to be reminded here as we're thinking about the explanation piece is that God did not save Cornelius through the vision. We've got to note that distinction. God gave Cornelius a vision, but God did not save him through the vision. Instead, what he did was he saved him through the message that Peter would proclaim to him. And so the vision said, hey, you need to go get this guy, but it was Peter's message. Why is that important? I think it's important for us to remember because God, here he's powerfully at work in drawing people to himself. But listen to me, he chooses to use you and I in the process. Think about it. I mean, does God need us? Well, not necessarily, no. And yet God chooses to use us to proclaim the gospel message to people so that we may see them be saved. It's like anytime one of my kids wants to help me with a project around the house, My 9-year-old, Lydia, she loves to help, okay? She also loves to have conversation. And so anytime that we're having, I say, hey, you want to help me with this? It's great. But we could have done it in 20 minutes, and now 2 hours later, we're talking about, Gabby's dollhouse, and we're the deep philosophical, what kind of animal is she? I don't know. It's all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, how did we get here? We were just trying to pump up the tires on your bike, It's did I need her to do that? No. But I love when she's a part of those things with me. Does God need us? No. Does God choose to use us in his process of drawing people to himself? Yes. And so let me say this, what Paul says in Romans 10. He says it so clearly. Paul says, how then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. And so faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. So let me just ask you, who are the Corneliuses in your life? Who are the people that God is drawing to himself, but he's choosing to use you in order to share the gospel, the good news with them? The last scene is this. So with these weird visions, we have this helpful explanation about what exactly is it that God's telling Peter to do. But then lastly, we see that there's major implications here. This is kind of a paradigm shift for the way that the church will think and move and act. And so in verse 30, it says, and Cornelius said, 4 days ago, about this hour, I was praying in my house. At the 9th hour, behold, a man stood before me in bright clothing, and he said, Cornelius, your prayer has been heard, and your alms have been remembered before God. Send therefore to Joppa and ask for Simon, who is called Peter. He is lodging in the house of Simon, a tanner by the sea. So I sent for you at once, and you have been kind enough to come. Now therefore we are all here in the presence of God to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord. So Peter opened his mouth and he said, truly I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. So what is Peter saying? He's saying that the gospel is for everyone. And Peter goes on then to preach the gospel to these Gentiles, and they put their faith in Jesus. But real quick, I think it begs the question, how is it that Peter in his life is able to make this shift so quickly? Just think, Peter was just literally arguing with God. Peter went from a very staunch no to now an enthusiastic yes. How do you make that shift in your life? Peter here, he's not simply preaching or fulfilling the commands of God merely out of obedience. It's not like God is asking him to do something and he's doing it like a little kid doing their chores. He's not doing it dragging his feet. He's doing it joyfully. He's doing it out of a changed heart. And here's the thing that's crazy here. What you realize is that it's the gospel that Peter is preaching to the Gentiles that has changed him so that now he has the joy to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. It's the same gospel that changed his heart that he's now preaching to them. This is how the gospel works. You say, well, how is it in my life that I'm supposed to do hard things and do things that are uncomfortable? How is it that I'm supposed to follow God? Really, what we see here is that there's two methods. There's two methods of following God. I've used this illustration before. No, this wasn't to keep you guys in line. So if I had this metal pipe, and I were going to bend this metal pipe, and I know what many of you are thinking, I could just do it in my brute strength. Thank you. I can't. My wife told me. But if I were going to bend this pipe, right, essentially what you have to do is one of two things. You could put some type of force on this, and through effort, you could begin to try to bend the pipe. But the problem with a brittle metal like this is you could start to bend it a little bit, but the second that you took that pressure off of it, what would happen to the pipe? It would kind of go back to its original shape. Or if you continue to apply pressure to it, because the metal is brittle, what would eventually happen is that the metal would break. It would break under the pressure of that effort. That's the first method of change that I think a lot of us end up stumbling ourselves into. That would be what we would call the change that religion tries to bring. See, what ends up happening in our life is we try to apply all of this effort, all of this energy in our own strength. The problem is, eventually, that you apply that effort, you get tired, you stop, you kind of just go back to how you were before. Yeah, maybe you changed for a little while, but that change wasn't lasting. Or maybe for some of us, you know this experience because you grew up in a church that was all about rules and effort. And you put so much time and effort into being a good person and looking good on the outside. And what ended up happening over time is you realize, I can't keep doing this. And so you broke. And you're like, hey, if this is what it's about, I'm not going to do any of this. All that pressure applied to your life, eventually you broke under the weight of the rules. But there's another way that you can bend this pipe. The other way that you bend it is you get something really, really hot and you heat the middle of it. And you begin to change the actual substance. The metal becomes soft and malleable. And as you heat it, you begin to bend the pipe and you realize that not only does the pipe bend, but it stays in the shape that you bent it. That's what the gospel does in our life. What the gospel does in our life is the gospel changes our heart. It heats and melds and molds our heart so that what we're doing in our life is we're not depending on our own effort. We're depending on the finished work of Jesus. And so the gospel changes our heart, not simply our behaviors. It's an inside-out change. So how is it that Peter is able to go from, God, don't send me there, to those people, to enthusiastically telling those people that Jesus is for them? It's because the gospel changed his heart. Let me end with just, as we're talking about this idea that gospel is for all people, let me just talk about one distinction and then one application for us as a church. So I think it's helpful for us on the distinction side to understand that we need to be careful to distinguish between our culture's understanding of inclusion and what Peter presents here in terms of gospel invitation. Because in our culture, all people are included. It's in vogue. It's like a cultural mantra. Like we accept everyone. But it's like, what does that actually mean? And so that might look good as a soundbite or as a sticker on a window, but the problem is that the cultural premise, it's built on a faulty foundation. Really, what we have in terms of a culture of inclusion is inclusion for inclusion's sake. There's no foundation. There's no base to it. And so what our society is left with isn't really a virtuous principle, but rather it's a faulty pipe dream. But we have something here in the gospel that is so much deeper and richer and lasting. The gospel, on the other hand, it is an invitation to people. What we see in Scripture is a picture of a gospel that actually does include all people. You get to all the way to the end of the Bible, and what do you see? You see all people around the throne room worshiping God. Revelation chapter 7, one of the most beautiful pictures that the Bible gives us. After this, I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, crying out with a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." So what makes Christianity different is that it actually includes people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, from different political parties, from different nationalities. And what unites these people is the foundation that Peter says in verse 35. Did you catch that? What's the foundation for all this? The foundation is those who fear God and obey Him. And that's a foundation that actually can hold up. It can stand. Because it's about God's glory and not about man's praise. It's a foundation that's result on God's glory and not on our inward praise. Now, take that. The application for our church then is this. Port City is called to be a church that welcomes everybody. That's the application. Port City is called to be a church that welcomes everybody. Because the gospel reminds us that when we were outsiders, when we were far from God, the Bible uses terms like aliens, strangers, enemies. When that was us, God came to us and invited us into His family. He welcomed us when we were far from Him. And so the gospel reminds us that it's not on our merit, it's not on our status, it's not on anything we bring to the table. It's on God's grace, on His kindness. That's why we have a seat at His table. And that truth, what it does is it creates a church that genuinely and authentically welcomes anyone who would show up. Let me brag on you guys for a second, because I think it's helpful for us to see how this is playing out. We'll close with this. You know, one of the things that they talk about is, I say they, it's just the ambiguous they, okay? They talk about how, you know, most people will make a decision about whether they're going to come back to a church within the first 7 minutes of being at that church, okay? Think about what happens in the first 7 minutes, okay? For some of you who show up on time, in the first 7 minutes, you come in, you get coffee, you know, the music hasn't even started playing yet, you know? Certainly, I haven't started preaching. So a lot happens within the first 7 minutes. What usually happens in the first 7 minutes when someone shows up at a church? They're met by somebody, or they're not met by somebody. In those first 7 minutes, the biggest impact that is made in terms of if people decide whether they're going to come back to church is not the music, it's not the preaching, it's the people. And one of the things I think is so beautiful about our church is that we have heard, you ask myself, you ask Pastor Chad, what we have heard over and over and over again is that there is a level of authenticity, a welcoming here at Port City Church. And you know why that's the case? Because we understand who Jesus was and what He's done for us. And so what you're doing is you're putting the gospel on display. The environment of authenticity that's being created here, that is exactly what the Bible is calling us to do here. And so my exhortation to you is keep going. Allow the gospel to be at work in our life in a way that is evident to those who show up. The gospel is for all people. So let's pray. Father, thank you so much that you love us, that you came for us when we were far from you. And God, we pray that we would be a church that exemplifies and then teaches that exact truth. That, Father, we would be identifying the Corneliuses in our life, knowing that you're at work, and God, with boldness and courage, Father, sharing what Jesus has done for them. God, I do pray for those in here today that, Father, they are Cornelius, that you are moving in their life, and maybe, God, there's a resistance in their heart. Spirit, would you break that down? And would they, Father, come, surrender their life, and follow Jesus? So we ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.